My name is Alexa White. I am the Executive Director of the Aya Research Institute, and our mission is to increase the amount of people of color involved in environmental justice research, specifically scientists and engineers like myself. And the goal is to bring people who are being affected by climate change and climate impacts into the space of resolving the problems. Okay, so I call myself an agroecologist, agriculture, and then ecology. So that means that I'm really interested in the intersection between the corridor of a farm and nature. When I was in kindergarten, my grandparents were cooking dinner for us, me and my two sisters, and they were cooking typical soul food, collard greens, and different kinds of proteins. And I asked them where this food came from and why they knew how to cook it so well, and they said they were sharecroppers, and that's where they first learned. And so that was when they told me about the history of sharecropping, and I realized that I had also learned that in kindergarten, understanding kind of the transition away from slavery into sharecropping and American history. Yeah, so throughout my childhood, from that moment on, we had a very intimate connection with food. And so we would grow different crops outside, so different fruits and vegetables. That gave me a lot of intimate time with my grandparents. And then as I grew up, I'd always loved food. It was just something that was kind of innate to me. And honestly, there was a big gap in between that period of my life and when I became a biologist. And so when I was a biologist, I didn't really think that there was any way to connect it. I was originally studying lizards. I realized later that that wasn't a passion of mine and that I really wanted to study farming and food. And it wasn't until I went back for Christmas during my PhD that my grandparents started talking again. I realized that inspiration came from them. Absolutely. So throughout time, there's something called food regimes, which is basically the history of food that we've seen throughout the world. And the increase in the amount of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers that are necessary for industrial agriculture came about in the 50s and the 60s as a result of war times. And so, although it might have been useful for those specific niches, it became popularized throughout the world. And so, although might have been useful for something at that time, has now proven to be very costly for the climate change impacts and carbon emissions of farming. So if we were to revert back to traditional ways of doing agriculture, those things wouldn't be needed. So for example, practices of indigenous knowledge don't require any of those inputs, and everything was fine and everyone was fed. The issues of global hunger are not really issues per se of production. They're really issues about distribution. So when you think about the global food system, the issue is how do we get people the food that is grown? Because most of the time it's wasted, or it's produced in very monocultural arrangements, which basically just means those kinds of things you see on TV where there's swaths of corn. That should really be diversified, and it's better ecologically for it to exist that way. So, through the connection between my family's sharecropping history and my PhD in biology, that gap I noticed is really one that a lot of people of color in science and engineering share. There's a very large disconnect in the work that we do, and a lot of times it doesn't really come from a place of passion. It comes from a place of kind of needing to prove ourselves, an imposter syndrome, or at least personally that's what I found. And through trying to make a change in that way, we have created Aya. So I, along with Adria Peterkin at MIT, have co-founded Aya in order to increase the amount of people that are doing what they really care to do. So we have three main reasons why we do it. One, scientists really aren't taught how to engage with communities or how to really bring their identity into their work. Two, they're usually not paid the same amount as they would be in a private industry. And then three, typically the people who are facing a lot of the environmental justice impacts, a lot of climate impacts, look like me. They look like people of color. And usually the people solving those issues in labs and who are called scientists and engineers aren't really in those rooms and being called to solve those problems. And they're really the key to making a change. If Aya is successful, there will be a whole new realm of knowledge production. The way that we understand the world today is very Eurocentric. Although we see science and engineering as very objective and kind of that is the way that we can see truth, there are many different versions of it that generally have been lost throughout history. So particularly African American knowledge of land and science, as well as indigenous knowledge of land and science, has been lost in the scientific realm, and it's clearly become an issue. In order for us to revert back to what is most natural and most sustainable, we have to reinvigorate those lines of thinking. And so if Aya were to achieve its mission, we would have many different ways of resolving the issue of climate change. And it also would take on a much more positive respect. So today the language around climate change is very doom and gloom. And the issue that's necessary, what's necessary for us to actually make change is some sort of kind of optimism. We've dealt with hard things before. There have been many bad things that have happened through history that we've gotten over. And this really isn't a huge difference between, for example, the civil rights movement and climate change in terms of how big it feels and how much of an issue it is. So if we were to provide solutions as opposed to problems, that would definitely be where Aya steps in. A lot of people base their ideas of agriculture on what they see on television because typically growing food and producing food is outsourced, right? So you go to the grocery store and that's the most connection that you have with any sort of food. But how did it get there? So a lot of the speaking engagements that I go to, I ask the audience, if you're in New York and it's January and you go to the supermarket and you want to get a mango, how do you get a mango in the middle of January in New York? It had to come from somewhere probably near the equator where it's pretty much in season all the time. It was probably produced by people that were not paid in an equitable way. And that's why it's so cheap for us to have it for like $2, $3. Then it's put on a truck, put in some sort of packaging that isn't really necessary, shipped away and put into a supermarket where you may or may not eat it. Because if we're being realistic, in America, there's a lot of food that's wasted just because we just forget that it's there because there's such an abundance. And so in terms of modern agriculture, my colleagues and I have an issue with the concept of industrial agriculture. And so that goes back to the inputs that we were talking about earlier. Pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, and different kinds of chemical inputs aren't necessary for us to really have a robust food system. What's necessary is for us to eat locally, eat within season. So for example, if you're in the Northeast, that's very different from something that you would eat if you were in LA. And being able to have a more intimate connection and with what you're eating, how you're eating it. And typically we call that in my field food sovereignty. So it's the right to have control over your food as well as have it be culturally relevant. Yeah, the vision of the future would be to get the food distributed. So small scale farmers produce enough food to feed the world. We've seen plenty of evidence for that. And we also have plenty of evidence that says that if we were to take out the most carbon intensive forms of food, so that would usually be protein, so livestock, we would all be okay. It's not necessary. And culturally, it's definitely relevant, and so I'm definitely not one to say that everyone should become a vegan. But what I am saying is that the way in which we go about receiving our food from these big kind of transnational agricultural corporations has to stop if we would like to survive beyond the next 50 years. One, because of the food supply, and then two, because of the climate change impacts. And so this past week, actually, in the Journal of Science, which is a really popular journal for us, they just said that in order for us to have the ability to kind of change the agricultural food system to be a lot less carbon intensive, we would have to decrease the amount of livestock. And so if you were to eat locally, eat a little bit less meat, and pay attention to the relevance of the politics of your food, everything would probably be better. And so the Aya Research Institute's goal is, one, to educate the public about these issues, because typically this isn't normal conversation. I can't just go and talk to my mom about it. Two, bring into the conversation the people that are most affected. So in Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from, there are a lot of food apartheids where typically there aren't that many supermarkets or places for people to get fresh fruits and vegetables. They would be the ones that would, for example, know the most about food scarcity and what they would like to do about it. And then three, Aya would be able to circulate the wealth and capital among the people that would be solving those problems. Please pay attention to your dinner. Please pay attention to this critical part of your day that you engage with food, and understand that it doesn't have to be outsourced. It doesn't have to be so disconnected from you and how you live your life. There are certain things that we do in our lives that take up a lot of time. Eating is one of them, and it requires and calls for a lot more attention than it typically is given. If I were to say one thing, it would just be pay attention to what you're eating, how you're eating, and why it's relatable to you. My favorite part about being me is honestly this, kind of the opportunity to communicate with others and give a little bit of a glimpse into my ancestry and history. Typically, the conversations that I have before this kind of moment in my life were very siloed and didn't really bring into the forefront my identity. And so it's very nice to see people appreciate those words and those connections, because then it inspires them to do the same, and usually that's moving them in a good direction. So I really enjoy science communication. I really think that that's my thing. My name is Alexa White. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Aya Research Institute. You can find us at ayaresearchinstitute.org or Aya Research Inst, INST, for any of our other social media handles. Thank you so much.